Hello, my name is Cheyenne, and I am an art education major at the University of West Georgia.
Hello, my name is Nate, and I am an autistic adult.
And this is the Autisticast. So this podcast is about, spreading awareness about autism and some of the harmful things that some companies have done for autistic people. So, Nathan, you want to get started?
Yes. I think one thing to open with is, clearing up some misconceptions and stuff like that and some of the popular conversation topics. And one of those is on what sort of language do we use with autistic people? Do we say an autistic person or a person with autism?
I think you should ask the person which one they would prefer. I think everyone has a different preference, so up to them.
That is very true. It's very up to the person. I've found that most people usually prefer an autistic person because it's something that informs the rest of their identity and personhood. So it would feel strange to say that it's like something they have, like almost to the same extent that someone doesn't have, like, if they're a religious person, they don't have a religion. Well, they do, but they don't say, I have a Christianity.
That's also a very good thing. It's more like it's something, it implies that it can change, has something that you're with is like, can you see that person with, like, red hair? It's a red-headed person. You'd probably say someone with red hair.
Right, exactly. Like, it just sort of, I guess, tries to diminish how influential that is on what makes that person that person. It suggests it's something that can be sort of isolated and just separated, when really it can't.
It's very good. And did you want to talk about your diagnosis?
Oh, yes. I was diagnosed at a very young age, before I went to preschool. When do people usually go into preschool?
About, I would say 4 or 5.
4 or 5. I'm really bad with timelines and stuff. But yeah, that's about when I was diagnosed. And once I was old enough to really understand the concept of what being autistic meant, I found it very helpful for me in, understanding why I was different from some of my classmates, why I sometimes had a hard time making friends, and why my experiences were the way they were.
I think it's very important for, especially young people, to be diagnosed or at least have a self-diagnosis. I recently am going through a self-diagnosis because it is harder for adults to be diagnosed. It's a lot easier for young people or children to be diagnosed because they have more opportunities to do and they aren't masking as much.
Right, absolutely. And I think that is a very interesting conversation that has been brought up a lot lately during sort of neurodiversity conversations, is that of professional diagnosis versus self-diagnosis. And I think both are valid, mostly just because, as you said, with adults it is harder to get diagnosed, and it can cost a lot of money to do so, and time and resources, and also if you're a woman or a person of color, or, many other demographics that aren't the stereotypical
white
nerd.
male.
Yeah, exactly. The stereotypical nerdy white male, Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. It's hard to get diagnosed. And another thing, too, is autism is really all developmental disorders are sort of social constructs, not in the sense that they aren't real, because, in the same way gender is a social construct, but it obviously is real and affects people's life. But the criteria by which we decide what makes people atypical rather than, neurotypical, those are all socially influenced and such. And so I think that makes the diagnosis process itself loaded with a lot of problems that benefit, the power structures that be.
Yeah, and going back to diagnosis in women and people of color and other demographics that aren't the typical white male, diagnoses, it's, what would you say is like a really hard thing? Because I found out that women and people of color mask a lot better in their childhood because of the ways that they're raised. Like, they're raised to be quiet, don't like speak unless you're spoken to. Be more quiet and reserved, so it's harder to find the characteristics of autism when you're taught to not really express yourself as much.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is a huge part of it, because part of why most people who are professionally diagnosed with autism are white men, it's because, they usually get a lot more power and privilege to behave how they wish. And as a result, women and people of color are often given stricter treatment. And so any sort of signs that they would give off that they are autistic are met with huge consequences. And thus they sort of receive a negative reinforcement to hide and mask aspects of themselves. So it's really hard to diagnose them because they've been trained so hard to act as if they weren't autistic.
And another thing about autism is that there are many links because of just how the autistic brain is to a lot of autistic people being members of the LGBTQIA plus community and having other mental health like disorders and conditions. Do you have anything like that, if you don't mind me asking?
Of course. I myself am someone who has struggled for a long time with depression and anxiety, and a lot of that is due to influences from being autistic. And I think part of that is when it's harder for you to relate to neurotypical people, you sort of feel like you're on the wrong planet, so to speak. That's a common sentiment by a lot of autistic people, and so you can feel really out of place, and that can be really depressing. And also, plus, with sensory issues, like, for example, I am very sensitive to issues of noise and different textures and light. That also can just lead me to being very anxious, especially in environments with lots of people. Sometimes it's even hard for me to go grocery shopping or sit in a crowded classroom.
I have struggled my whole life with mostly anxiety and then, depression here and there, mostly in my later years, middle school and on. But I just thought all of these symptoms of anxiety, were just anxiety and not anything more. And, that's what I've always been told. Like, oh, it's just your anxiety, or, oh, you're too sensitive, or you need to grow up, things like that. And then plus, a lot of autistic people struggle with gender as well, because it is such a weird social construct of, you must be this and this, but autistic people are, they struggle and to understand that concept because it is such an abstract concept.
Right, because that's the thing. I think part of why queerness is so common in the autistic community is if you already experience the world in a way that goes against what is considered typical, neurotypical, then I think you're probably more comfortable with being divergent in other aspects of your life as well, in gender and sexuality.
And then there's a lot of hate towards, not only the queer community, but also with ableism against autistic people. And there are companies out there that technically promote this like Autism Speaks and their logo. There's a lot of problems there. What are your opinions on Autism Speaks?
Oh yeah, I think Autism Speaks is a very harmful organization, and there's multiple reasons why for that. Number one, it's the biggest autism charity. Like, if you may have gone to several things where companies or fraternities or sororities
or even Walmart sells Autism Speaks merch during Autistic Awareness Month.
Right, exactly. It's very common to see events and fundraisers for Autism Speaks. But the truth is, very little money donated to Autism Speaks actually goes towards helping any autistic people and families. It's somewhere towards their family services is like 1% of their budget.
Yeah, and a lot of that donation money, they're not a nonprofit, are they?
I actually don't know if they are a non-profit or not off the top of my head, but I know that the money goes towards awareness and lobbying and fundraising is where most of it goes. So, in other words, to just further itself.
Yeah, and that doesn't sound very nonprofit if it's just worried about expanding its company rather than actually using the money to help autistic people and their families.
And another problem, too, is it brands itself as Autism Speaks, which sort of implies that they value autistic voices. But yet, they only have one person out of a total of 28 people on its board of directors that is autistic. And there's a common saying among autistic people that you can't have anything about us without us. And if you're going to claim to be an organization that values autistic voices, I think it would make sense to have more autistic voices actually in leadership positions on your organization.
I think that's also very good. And then their logo also causes problems because it's just become the general logo for many just other companies to use, which is the puzzle piece. And there's many concerns with that. It started because they saw autism as a puzzling condition and that there was a piece missing. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I've always found problems with the puzzle piece logo because it just sort of seems to imply that autistic people are incomplete, that they're missing something and they aren't whole like a neurotypical person would be. And I think that also just goes to a bigger issue of how Autism Speaks very fundraising strategies tend to portray autistic people as lesser than they actually are. They often portray autism as mysterious and frightening and, sort of even imply that it's a condition that needs to be cured rather than a difference that needs to be cherished. And I think this is even further shown in the fact that one of their big things is Autism Awareness Month. The truth is, I don't really think there's very many people out there, if any, that are unaware of autism. Everyone knows about it. The issue is that autism needs to be accepted.
And I also think the awareness is good, but they're only saying that it is something that exists. They're not telling you what the characteristics are or the symptoms, if you will. They're just saying that, oh, it exists, but the main people that they portray having it, like you said in the beginning, are these Sheldon-like characters, very nerdy white men that have a very difficult time, like, talking and have very direct speech, but that's obviously not true.
Right, absolutely. Autism is a spectrum, which means there's a variety of ways to be autistic. There's a saying, if you've met one autistic person, you've met just one autistic person. Each of us are incredibly varied, and we have our own wealth of differences, and I think that's something to be cherished rather than something to fight against or say it only has to be one way or another.
And to kind of combat this puzzle piece logo, I actually designed my own, which is going to be the kind of cover art of this podcast, and it is a magnifying glass, because many autistic people, if not all of them, have varying special interests that they focus in on, whether that be for years or just a couple of months, but they always look very, very closely at it and get really in depth with it. And I also wanted to include a spectrum, because autism is a spectrum, so I put the rainbow spectrum, and also because of that linkage to the LGBTQIA community.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. I love that sort of logo, especially because I like the neurodiversity logo. It's an infinity symbol that's in rainbow, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think they have something that's exclusively for autism, not just for other neurodivergent conditions.
And then for our closing of the podcast, would you say that autism is a gift or a disability?
Well, I think it's both in a certain sense, but I do think we shouldn't shy away from using the word disability. I know with my parents, they always raised me and talked about how it was a gift and it was a superpower. And I know they had the best of intentions, but that sort of language can also be a lot to live up to in a certain sense, because it sort of makes you feel like you're wrong for struggling because you're autistic, or the struggles you have are, made up. Or even there can be that of comparison, like when they say autism is a superpower, they usually mean they're talking about like a kid who's 12 and is this brilliant mathematician and can solve these equations that Einstein couldn't solve. You hear stories about that, and I think that can sort of debase those who aren't like that, since, that's not the norm, and for most people, autism is disabling. And the thing is, I also think it's important that we know that disability is not a bad word. It's not a negative word. It is just simply a description of how things are. Like, we wouldn't say that it's problematic for someone who is left-handed to have a hard time writing in typical notebooks, because I've heard people talk about the need for left-handed notebooks. It's just a description of how things are and how it can be harder to be in the world that is set in the way in which it is.
And with the boy that, a 12-year-old boy that can solve amazing equations, that's probably just because his special interest is in numbers, which many autistic people have a special interest in numbers and they find it really interesting. So it can be a gift in a way that they have the ability to focus more on their special interests. But it's kind of bad that people are afraid to say disability, because it's not necessarily giving you superpowers or a special ability. It does disable you in certain ways. And like you said, you wouldn't call a left-handed person disabled, but some people call it a disability because it makes it harder for them in certain ways.
Right. And I guess another thing, too, to add with that is there's also just a huge disparity in what we consider a gift and not, and what we don't consider a gift. Like, for example, with the kid with the equations, usually the ones that are seen as gifted are the ones that can do something that's, profitable. Like, oh, this person is a computer genius or something like that. But say somebody, due to their anxiety, has a hard time living without assistance, without somebody there to help them, but they they have volumes upon volumes of fan fiction. I think that's a creative act that requires a lot of talent, but I don't think people would refer to that as gifted in the same way they would a talented autistic computer programmer.
That is also very true. If their special interests are not seen as profitable or a way to make a career, then their parents are like, oh, he has a disability. But if the special interest is in something that can be made into a career, they're like, oh, he's really gifted. He's just, gifted. He should be in the gifted program.
Right, exactly. And it almost makes it sort of a party trick. I'll never forget one time I was talking to someone, and it was brought up that I was autistic, and the first thing the person said to me afterwards was, "What's your superpower?" And I was like, I don't know. I'm just a person. I don't have any things to show you, to impress you with. I don't have a spectacle to give you.
What are you saying, that autism isn't caused by a radioactive spider?
Oh, no. Although I did have a special interest in Spider-Man, so I don't know.
I think people are comparing disabilities to try and lessen them in a way by calling them superpowers, but they're not. You need to see it for as it is and respect people with those disabilities as you would respect anyone.
Yeah, it's okay to be disabled. Many more people are disabled than we usually have language for. But we just have to value people as they are and value people for their differences rather than shame them or say that one type of person is less than another kind of person.
Well, I think this was a very good podcast, and I look forward to talking to you more.
Yes, as do I. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome.